Hi, everyone. Welcome to Afterlife. This is your host, Pooja Chilukuri, and I'm very excited about my guest today. Jacob Cooper is my guest today, and Jacob is the best-selling author of Life After Breath and The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. He's a sought-after speaker on grief, wisdom, and consciousness, offering meditation and mindfulness seminars to help others find purpose and overcome fears of life after death. As a clinical social worker, Reiki Master, and certified hypnotherapist specializing in past life regression, Jacob uses his extensive personal and professional experience to empower one soul at a time. Welcome to the show, Jacob.
Oh, such an honor. Thank you for having me, Pooja. Really, I'm so glad that the heavens opened up and we connected.
Me too, me too. And I just have read both your books. I've read your memoir, Life After Breath, and I read your recent release, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I haven't been able to put them down. Like I read them both in one shot. And The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder, I have to tell you, I have to go back and read again and again because there was so much wisdom in there. So,
Thank you.
without further ado, I'm going to jump right into it. Love for you to share your near-death experience with us.
Yes, well, thank you for your high compliments on both of my books. It really means the world to me. But at 3 years old, September 1993, I had an NDE due to suffocating as a result of whooping cough. And I went to a playground that day, and I wasn't able to breathe due to suffocation. And so I was climbing a ladder onto a slide, hence the name, the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. And I got to the top of the slide and I just started to suffocate, where there was no breath to hold on to. There was no life that I was experiencing. It was just this endless period of torture and suffering, that I was having and suffocating and trauma. But, after when I was suffering and suffocating, I was able to surrender to something else. And this was a breath beyond my human body. And this was the breath of eternity. And so while my actual human breath wasn't working, I recognized that there's a breath within all of us, the breath of creation. And so I was able to surrender to this. And once I surrendered, I acknowledged the pain, but understood that, it came and gone, that this breath of eternity triumphed the breath of the human body that was taken from me. It was when I was able to transcend this experience and cross over. And I had a profound near-death experience, which I chronicle in both my books. But I encountered, all that was inside of me that was always around me that maybe, I and so many of us lost sight of. And this included, angels, spirit guides, soul family members, a purpose to our life, and even the highest endless pinnacle of reality as we know it, which all things emanate from. And the best way that we could describe that in our vernacular is God, but it goes far beyond, a word to describe that. So it was profound. It was a roller coaster of intense lows and the highest of highs that you could possibly imagine. Wouldn't wish it on anyone, but wouldn't trade it for anything. And I'm grateful for it. It was a real blessing from the heavens to have this experience. I'm grateful for every part of it.
And I'm so grateful that you took the time to share that experience with us, Jacob. I remember from reading your memoir and from listening to you right now, it was when you were a child. And
Right.
one of the things I wonder about crossing over, experiencing reality from a very different point of view. Did you still feel like that was the child Jacob that was experiencing all that you experienced?
Yeah. I think two things could be true at the same time. We live in a reality where it's like, right, we have one thing and that has to be true, and that's it. So, when I was crossing over on the other side, yes, I was aware of myself in that 3-year-old self, but I was also the real experience this, came from beyond my 3-year-old body. This was the soul that I was experiencing it in my infinite awareness. And so I think each and every one of us has attachment to our chronological ages, our cultures, our jobs and all this stuff. And these are all things that we are experiencing, but they're not the full totality of our stories. Our stories go far beyond this chapter, this page that we're currently on. And so having this NDE, it's controversial and thought provocative because people say, well, you're just an infant. What do you know? And I say, no, we're never just an infant. You're an infinite spiritual being experiencing yourself as an infant, but
Mm-hmm.
there's an awareness far beyond, that age or how you present to the world or how the world sees you. There's so much more
Mm-hmm.
that meets the eye, not just in the spirit realm, but also to children and infant and to all of us, and particularly most of us looked at the very surface at each other and miss so much more that meets the eye.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. One of the things that I want to ask, I'm dying to ask you, is did you experience any kind of fear, any kind of judgment? Because a lot of people have, and myself included, used to have a lot of anxiety about, just around the subject of death. And ever since I've
Right.
been watching NDEs, that's dissipated. But I'm just curious, what was your experience like? Did you feel fear or judgment or any of those things?
When I was suffocated, yeah, that was the scariest moment of my life, but it's also a blessing of trauma. I firmly believe without that trauma, I probably wouldn't be here today telling the story. Trauma
Mm-hmm.
was the gift of memory. Many people disassociate with trauma, but some have very strong ability to remember it as if it's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
So trauma was the gift that I had and being able to fully recall it, but certainly suffocating, yeah, that was the scariest moment of my life. Um, but it was very short. It was very intense and very short, but I was able to have healing once I really crossed over. So here's what I'll say. You know, I view a lot of near-death experiencers and people who have had near-death experience, and some talk about distressing near-death experiences. Honestly, when you cross over, there's no room for negativity or fear or judgment. That doesn't exist. Um, and I think if any of that, it's your own that you experience and it's your own adjustment, but that's not reflective of what's over there. What's
Mm-hmm.
over there is so beyond this reality in terms of the immense amount of love, support, guidance, that's there that it's something far beyond anything that we've experienced in this love, no matter how much unconditional love we have, there's infinite more over there, you know.
Yes. And I also realize and understand that language that we use here is very limited.
Right.
Probably what you experience, and forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but I'm sure it's hard to describe it in human words. And
Right.
and
Right.
you were 3 years old, so I wonder, like coming back into your body, was that difficult? Was that difficult to explain to others what you've been through? Like, how was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm learning stuff about my near-death experience every day. I mean, there was a part of me that, early on really didn't talk about it. So I threw out in early interviews and said, okay, I was 4 or 5 years old because I'm my own biggest skeptic. And I couldn't imagine like I was this young. I knew I was in preschool, but like I forgot like, oh, okay, you could be 4 or 3, you could be 3 years old in preschool. So I spoke to my parents and they told me that I was 3 years old, which blew my mind because it just seems like just yesterday. And I'm like, geez, how do I yeah. But also my father told me that shortly after my experience, and I'm just kind of using my language now, but I told him, remember when I was rushed to the hospital after having my NDE, something profound happened, which won't make sense to you now, but one day it will. And, my dad told me that, that I told him that. I don't remember telling him that, but he's, very left brain logical. He's also a therapist, so he's not like woo woo or isn't going to make any stuff up. What you see is what you get in many ways. So, but having the trauma of the near death experience also influenced my brain because my brain was deprived of oxygen and I felt a large snap in my brain. There's a saying, my brain cracked open and God came in. Well,
Oh,
which literally that happened to me. I mean, my brain, I felt a large crack in my brain. And once this happened, I was really able to have a full crossover experience as well as surrendering to it. Um, but I recognized that my brain was much different. And, within this reality, there's two sides of consciousness. There's a rigid material reductionalism,
mm,
which will say that the brain produces the
yeah.
mind,
Mhm.
or, near-death experiences kind of put that, into question because if you have these NDEs, then how are you supposed to have any development of thought or mind? Bear in mind something that's you're able to remember, like myself, 30 years later, something so clear. So where is that coming from? So I think the brain filters the mind, but doesn't produce it. But very early in my childhood, I would have a lot of these, mediumistic experiences, and I was crossing over on a regular basis. But I recognized that the world around me was so blind to this stuff, and they were
Mhm.
so foreign to them. So in a sense, I might have the physical suffocation that I had in my NDE might have stopped, when I went to the hospital and was taken care of, but the emotional, psychological suffocation continued for several decades later in
Mhm.
my life, where I just felt very alone. Um, it wasn't until I picked up a book by an author and a friend of mine named Betty Eadie, called Embraced by the Light. She's
Mhm.
been featured on Oprah Winfrey in the 90s, that gave me a language for this kind of thing. I thought I was the only one that had it. So Betty's book changed my life and gave me the vernacular that my friend Dr. Raymond Moody
Mhm.
establishes this as a thing, and it's called a near-death experience. But
Mhm.
to me, it was just something that I didn't have a term for that I kept very close to my heart.
Yep. That's incredible, Jacob. You said something very profound, and I'm going to repeat it because I think it's important. You said that the brain filters the mind. It doesn't produce it. I have to
No,
write that down somewhere for myself.
the
Uh,
brain does not produce consciousness. I,
yeah.
I am living proof of that. Yeah.
Yes, yes, you definitely are. And you also said something else, you discovering Betty's book. Yeah, I think I've heard her story. It's incredible also. But, being a child, being a teenager, there's this human part of you that wants to fit in, right? So I know you having these spiritually transformative experiences crossing over probably made it very difficult as a teenager to, adjust and fit in. So do you want to comment on that? Because I know teenagers go through a lot anyways, but to have that
Yeah.
extra, yeah,
It was very hard. I mean, there's always black sheep in families, but my family, we had the same food, we had the same house, we had the same parents, but I was by far the most difficult child of them all. And what was the differentiating factor? I understand there's black sheeps and differences, but I was a tremendous outlier beyond a black sheep.
yeah,
I started therapy at 10 years old. I was just someone who wreaked havoc. But in a way, there was a reality that I was resisting in some way, that I wasn't agreed with, or it just didn't make sense. I think sometimes we forget that part of ourselves, that we aren't these kids, we're these infinite souls, and the world sees us as that. So there's conformity. So I guess to myself to survive, I had to kind of bury this,
mm,
away and just kind of learn how to be a kid and bury that awareness that saw past, this kind of thing. But I think to thrive, I had to make sense of it. And that happened, still happening every day.
yeah.
So, to be called a kid or to go through this again, knowing that I'm not a kid and experiencing myself as that was quite challenging. It lead to a lot of defiant behaviors. And, because people were looking at me as something that I knew that I just was not.
I
Oh, so much more.
Yeah, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, what a and again, the word burden maybe isn't the right word, but I'm thinking what a special burden to have because I think being forgetful, I know we're souls, we come here, we forget, we're adjusting to this body, but in some ways it makes it easier to have the human experience. I don't know. What do you feel like with all that awareness, has it made it harder? Is it easier? Like I'm just trying to,
Right. It made my childhood a lot harder.
yeah, I can imagine.
That's undeniable. For many reasons. I mean, the trauma of suffocating what I had, made quite a tumultuous childhood, combined with just, you know, how awkward it was, knowing what I knew
Yeah.
and other people not. It just kind of like everyone's on this conveyor belt. You take yourself out of it and you recognize what's going on. And you probably know more than the adults, kind of dictating the
Mm-hmm.
conveyor belt. I mean,
Yeah.
oh,
So,
but to kind of survive the next like chapters, you just kind of need to conform and
yeah,
do and play the game. So I had to kind of bury that in a way.
yeah.
But I think as an adult, it's been a lot more rewarding, as I've come into my own. Um, but with great power of awareness comes great responsibility, I would say. I mean, this NDE, is a big responsibility. It just doesn't take care of itself on its own. So it required an immense amount of work and vulnerability, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. But I recognize that this experience wasn't just for me. I think we have a term and that's always thrown out that says we are one. But what exactly does that mean? Oneness does not mean sameness because we're not all the same.
No.
We are unique, we are different, but beyond that difference is a phyla of connectivity. But I learned in my NDE having it, in a playground wasn't trivial. It wasn't by accident. There's a saying, we're all children in God's playgrounds. Here as our brothers and sisters keeper, responsible for one another.
Yeah.
So to me, that meant, okay, I'm responsible to help out others.
Mhm.
And this near-death experience is something profound for me to give to others. It wasn't just a gift for me to hold on to. It was a gift for me to give to others, to not tell anything new that people didn't know, but to remind them of what they already know deep within.
Mhm. And thank you for sharing your gift with us, because I think when you do that, you give others permission to share their gift. Because sometimes I wonder, how many of us have spiritually transformative experiences, whether it's near death or something else, and we bury that gift because we're struggling so hard to fit in the world around us. So
Right.
thank you for sharing your gifts. Yes. And I do have a question about, speaking of the world. One of the things I remember reading in your memoir that struck me was, you said you experienced like spirit guides and angels, and there was a Christ awareness. But being at 3 years old, those were probably not things you had already heard or familiar with, because
No.
sometimes people say, you see or hear things that you already taught, but that wasn't part of your upbringing, right? Was
No.
it? Yeah.
Which really gives a lot more validity to the experience.
Yeah.
And it's congruent with near-death experiences. I mean, there are people who are atheists, who totally don't believe in God and all of a sudden have their minds blown, or people who might grow up, in Islamic faiths and they experience Jesus, or, then the NDE has nothing to do with religious viewpoints.
Yeah.
And if it does, to me, it's not an authentic NDE. You're just kind of carrying over, what you prior believe. It should be something, in a way, totally different than religious programming or condition.
Hmm. With
Spirituality transcends that to me.
And can I ask you a question out of curiosity? I'm very curious about this because I don't know anything about this. Um, I've heard of angels, but you mentioned spirit guides. Is there a difference?
Yes, yes. Angels are more, you think, the term micro and macro, right? Macro is more of like big picture and more
Mhm.
focused on the greater good, the greater whole. Spirit guides to me are more micro. Spirit guides are more focused on the individual. They're contracted with you, and they're beings that, to me, are your closest things to you that we know it as. They are your cheerleaders. They are your biggest supporters. They're here contracted you before you get here, beings that you have a profound connection with. Um, I think the deepest connection you could have with almost any being is your spirit guides. And with time, I think spirit guides evolve, but your two primary guides that you come into this world with, stay. Your primary guides
Mm,
stay throughout your lifetime. Other guides on a on a more distant level kind of come and go, but your nuclear guides, are
mhm,
are the closest thing to you as you know it. Um, so I connected to an infinite amount of angels that I saw, and they were more uniformal in presentation. They're less
mhm,
focused on me and more focused on the greater planet and
mm,
situation at hand. But in a sense, like all they were doing was just giving energy with, no form of identity other than to give love.
yeah.
And I almost had to like smack myself because it seemed more real than real. It was such an adjustment. Again, there's an
Oh,
adjustment phase that you go through when you do cross over, no matter how old or how young you've been on this earth for, you still carry like that part of you that is processing this through your earth experiences. And then you settle into your soul and your familiarity with it. Uh, but these angels that I saw weren't, millions of miles away. They were right, you know, overlaying this reality right here. It's just
Mm-hmm.
the thinnest veil ever separating this reality and the angelic realm. It's
Yeah.
so thin, I can't begin to describe how thin of a veil, but it's as real as looking at someone. It's like right in front of you, just a thin veil of separation.
And thank you for saying that, because one of the lies, and I'm going to say it, and I think I bought into it, is that the separation is so great between heaven and here. And
No, it's not.
yeah,
I mean, it felt in many ways like I was a million miles away. Yeah. But then also a part of it was really right overlaying my body on the ground in the playground.
yeah,
It was right there. So yeah, that's really my inspiration, that the hereafter doesn't have to be after, it is now. It's around us, inside of us,
yeah.
not millions of galaxies away. It can be, because you're talking about the infinite. So the
Hmm.
infinite is not one place that you could point to and say, this is it. So
Yeah,
it's all around us, near and far,
yeah.
all inside of us at the same time.
And listening to you also gives me hope that we're never alone, right? You're talking about the guides, the angels. So, Jacob, I am very curious. What I know this experience, you process it, it's taken the time, you're sharing your gifts, but what led you to the work that you're doing? Because I know you're, a psychotherapist, a social worker, a hypnotherapist. Like, is there a story behind that?
I mean, yeah, I would say at the very basic, I was given my life given back to me when I
Mhm.
was not able to hold on to anything and experience endless suffering. I was saved from that and experienced euphoria and the
Mhm.
recollection that there is only life. Life is only that there is. But later in life, I remember, and I recognized that people could be alive but could really be dead. They're not connected, or they're not really truly living. So the key is to live while we live. So my goal was really to give back that life force that I was given back in my NDE to other people who just felt out of sorts or disconnected, to really gain back their power and something that was always inside of them. They're kind of like the Wizard of Oz, like you had the power all along in you,
Yeah.
but sometimes we forget that, and our identity of suffering triumphs our true identity of endless love and endless potential inside of all of us. So I think it's really is about, filling each person that I connect to in their box in a different way. Our box
Mhm.
determines our reality. How we see ourselves in this box when we fill it in will determine how we see reality. So if you're able to be vulnerable enough, to make the unknown something that you don't fear, and something that you transform, it could change. When you think about it, the world was once seen as flat, throughout the majority of societies we know it. But through daring discovery, they were able to understand that that is not the case, that the world is
Mhm.
round.
Yeah.
So they were able to challenge what they knew, to allow themselves to go into the unknown. And I think people get stuck of this afterlife stuff because they'd rather hold on to what they know than to open themselves up to what they don't know. So I
Mhm.
think growth comes from making friends with the unknown and constantly expanding our horizons, knowing that we can't die, from that, but we can die in a way from stagnation. We can't
Yes.
die from not moving. That is not living while we're living. To me, life force is kind of like a body of water. It replenishes itself. It's not a
Mhm.
stagnant body of water that has no flow. No one wants to be around that.
Yeah.
You want to
Yeah.
be around something that's fresh and recreates itself and expands and has a rhythm to it.
And I really appreciate you sharing that stagnation. I think a lot of us cannot move past our pain.
Right.
Um, I've even heard, and I don't know if it's true, that we can become addicted to our pain. So I
We
appreciate
are.
it. Yeah.
As a society, just look at the news. What's there? It's not angels and
Yeah.
fairies. It's us versus them. That kind of thing. And
Yeah.
we're taking on political identities to triumph our spiritual identities.
And actually, that brings me to a lot of the insights that I found in your recent book, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I love that book. I really do. I've already ruined it. I've like underlined it, written in it.
I'll have
So,
to send you a signed copy to,
yes, thank you. So one of the things I learned from that, you're helping people process grief. And there's something you say in that book that touched me very deeply because I'm very attached to the people that I love, and I cannot imagine losing them. But you talk about the journey going from that empty chair during the holidays to feeling connected with them all the time. So that process, I'm just curious, how do you even begin to process?
right. Like I said before, two things could be true at the same time. You could spiritually be aware of all these things, but you could also allow yourself to have natural human emotions. I don't believe the soul grieves. I think our psyches and emotions grieve. The soul knows, and it's infinitely connected on a deep level, to loved ones who have crossed over. But our minds,
Oh,
emotions, and psyches, grieve, I believe.
yeah.
Um, and so we could have both the human awareness and the spiritual awareness, and I think it's important to allow yourself to have both of those coexisting and to not judge yourself if you're not, because we live in a very trendy world. We just want to get on to the next thing. We just don't allow ourselves to be. So, yeah, I think really an authentic life is just allowing yourself to unfold as is without judgment of where you think you should be, or, just allowing yourself to be as is. Um, that will not necessarily change the fact that the person isn't there as you know it, or won't necessarily change your grief, because however long you knew the person is how long you're going to grieve. But it
Mhm.
does mean that the grief does not have to take over your life, and you could function and find meaning with it beyond the pain that you experience in some of the acute grief stages early on.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Jacob. And also another question I have is, you know, if people have anxiety around this whole process of death, because again, when I told someone that I was starting a podcast where I was going to be interviewing people over, who've crossed over, I sensed some resistance. Like this is not a comfortable topic for many of us. So, your story, the one of the things that was really touched me when you talk about there being a lot of love on the other side, there's nothing to fear. Uh,
Mm.
did you experience that just through the spirit guides, or did you see family members? Like, I'm just curious.
I've myself really had a lot of interdimensional communication beyond just my NDE, and so I've had even an out of body experience, in my early college years, which was profound as well, and I think my NDE, influenced that as well. I think a lot of near-death experiencers come back with gifts from interdimensional communication, more heightened intuitive senses, just more of a familiarity and connection to that. Um, but what I would say is it's a very rational belief system for people to fear death. I do the two biggest fears that people have, which is public speaking and death. Those are the two biggest things that normal people have, death and public speaking. But as a therapist, I could tell you that there is such a thing as short term and long term.
Mm-hmm.
Short term, yes, talking about this stuff for people who have fears to it will escalate potentially some of those fears. But through gradual exposure and at least talking about it, eventually those fears could be reframed and they could be lessened. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think the greatest fear comes through isolation or just burying things away. That's when the fear will overtake our lives. Through
Mm-hmm.
gradual exposure, through talking about these subject matters, we could find a way to transform that box from fear, into acceptance and love and meaning in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so it's a relationship that we have. We could look at death through fear, or we could look at death to really accept our life, recognizing, hey, we're not in this body forever. Let's make the most of it, you know, and I'm living proof that anything could happen at every given moment in time. I know it's just an
Mm-hmm.
instant roll going to a playground and boom, that was it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that could happen to any of us. And so how do you want to live with that? Do you want that to take away life itself? That's death right there. Or do we want it to motivate your life so that you can live while you live in your best life, regardless of what happens in the afterlife? There's a death that I know happens within this life through fear.
Mhm.
I'm obviously living proof of it, but you know, if you're fearing it so much, you're not really living while you're living. You're the walking dead.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you, thank you. So, Jacob, tell me a little bit about your work. Who would be, because I'm also in the wellness space. So,
Sure.
if I wanted to refer someone to you, is that a person that's dealing with grief? Is that a person who's emotionally dealing with pain? Who do you work with?
Yeah. I mean, at this point, you have a brain and a body. There's something that we could work towards,
Yeah.
but I do a plethora of services from hypnosis, which is a form of hypnotherapy, is past life regression, which I primarily do these days. New York State, I provide psychotherapy because I'm only covered by my state licensure,
Okay.
to do that. But I also, coach people in a spiritual way, consciousness consulting. I help
Mhm.
out people who are wanting to write books, as
Mhm.
authors. I coach writers. I do provide in-person or distance Reiki session, mindfulness session, so I do groups and individual sessions. So I believe we are multidimensional beings and not just our bodies. We have, psychological makeups, we have emotional makeups, we are a person in our environment, so I think, my goal is to meet people where they're at and finding different ways to navigate the needle of their lives to progress to greater heights in their situations.
That's awesome. And your books we can find, I got mine off of Amazon, and is that the best place to get your books also?
Yeah, that's the majority of, where I do. I mean, occasionally, I will send a signed copy, but I do a lot of book signings, in Long Island, where I live in New York, but I'm also going to Chicago, coming up, which I'll post on my website. I'm going to be going to a place called Lilydale, New York,
Mm-hmm.
in August 8th, which is the center of spiritualism, you know, it's like a community that was featured on the Oprah Winfrey Network and HBO, but
Yeah.
essentially it's just residents mediums who reside there, who are evidential mediums, and people go there for, readings and just, connection to loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
And the movement is called spiritualism, and the term spirit is more of a Native American kind of term. It gets a lot of credibility from, England and stuff like that, but really Native Americans are the ones who coined it, because when you think of the term spirits, they would drink spirits and they would connect with the ones. So that's really where the term spiritualism kind of comes from, is how the natives would drink spirits, and that's why spirits are called spirits. They're
Yep.
spirits to connect to spirits.
Yeah.
Just
Makes
happened to
sense.
me in my life, but I wouldn't recommend it. There's natural ways with abusing your
There's,
brain and, in your liver and stuff like that,
yeah,
uh, connect to spirits.
yeah, that makes sense. So I'm going to include all of your information in the show notes, but the best way for people to reach you, do you prefer email?
Yeah, email is great. I'm also on social media. I have a Facebook page, Jacob
Yes.
Cooper, LCSW. I'm on Instagram, Twitter. So trying to create more community. I think we've gotten so far away from that, but
Mm-hmm.
we could be not necessarily hunting society, but we could be a gathering society with Wi-Fi these
Yeah.
days. So we've gone away from community.
Yeah.
So my goal is to create community, but it's hard. I mean, I just did a Facebook Live yesterday, maybe had 5 or 6 people. It at the moment I was like, all right, come on. But those who are meant to be there will be there. You just never know, even if
Yeah.
it's one person who's listening, the impact that you could have on that person.
The
So
ripple effect, right? The ripple
that's it.
effect.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's it. So I'll definitely make sure I include everything in the show notes. And before I let you go, I do have one last question.
sure.
Um, your book, your recent book, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder, I've read it once
Thank you.
and I'm going to read it again. But I have a question here almost towards the
Sure.
end, and I'm actually going to read from it. And then I'm going to ask you for your comments.
Oh, sure.
So here's the quote. I remembered that I was not born here, but rather had a purpose that was orchestrated far before I came here. I learned that my life was not a life that was physical or material, but rather a way to step past the illusion and use these tools for the spiritual. The physical spiritual battle that we face is the ultimate measurement of integration of heaven and earth. When the two work with each other, the dissipation of darkness goes away and a magnificent light is cast.
Right.
Yeah.
It's important to remember who you are and not what you are.
Mhm,
The identity of the what has triumphed the who.
mhm,
And that's a problem because what we are, we're not our jobs, we're not our houses, we're not our cars. We are experiencing those things, but those things come and go. And so, who are we? Is the question. And the more that we're able to see ourselves past a body, the more that we'll able to understand that there is a part of us that goes beyond us. But even more that, I think when people see themselves as a body, they want more physical things. That will determine their identity.
mhm,
When you see yourself as a soul, physical things are okay, but you're less attached to it. But you understand the ultimate currency is impact and connectivity, and
mhm,
uplifting others. That is something that lasts. So there's no greater compliment than this person made this world a better place. Not a bigger place, not a richer place, but a better place.
mhm.
They gave someone that money can't buy, which is joy, which is love, which is peace. And I think that's what we're all here to do. Um, getting past the illusion that our success is only as good as the next person's success. Um, when someone else is hurting, we're hurting. So oneness doesn't just mean, hey, spending thousands of dollars, on these retreats and meditating, lighting incense, but then not really caring about people. That's not it. It's walking the talk and having compassion and care and service mind to other people.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jacob. I think if each person, kind of awoke to this world would
Right.
definitely be a better place. Yes. Thank you
Absolutely.
so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I really appreciate you being on this show. Thank
In
you.
other words, going to a yoga studio with Lululemon outfits does not make you spiritual. What you make out of those Lululemon outfits will, right?
Right. And that's
Right,
where the magic happens.
right, right,
Right.
right.
Yes.
Yep, you
Totally
got it.
appreciate this conversation with you, Jacob.
We
Thank
will.
you.
Thank
All
you.
right.